Most people think they know why Napoleon Bonaparte spent nearly 2 decades at war with the rest of Europe. They picture a brilliant, ruthlessly ambitious general who simply couldn't stop conquering, a man drunk on glory and power, dragging an exhausted continent from one battlefield to the next because his ego demanded it. It's a clean story with a clear villain, the insatiable emperor, and a clear explanation, personal ambition. But here's the problem. That story is dangerously incomplete, and in some ways it's flat out wrong. Napoleon's ambition did not cause the Napoleonic Wars. Let me say that again because it matters. His ambition was real, and it mattered. But the deeper engine driving 2 decades of continuous European warfare wasn't a personality. It was a financial system, one built by necessity out of a bankrupt French state that made continuous war not a choice, but a requirement for survival. What actually caused the near-constant warfare of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic era is a far darker, more complicated, and more human story than you've been taught. It involves a monarchy that went bankrupt financing someone else's revolution, a currency so worthless that French citizens were burning it for warmth, an army that was ordered to feed, clothe, and pay itself by plundering the very countries it conquered, because Paris simply could not afford to, a British government that spent staggering sums of gold specifically to keep Continental armies fighting France on Britain's behalf, and an economic blockade so consequential that it may have done more to trigger Napoleon's catastrophic invasion of Russia than any question of glory ever did. Napoleon's wars weren't simply the product of one man's hunger for conquest. They were, to a significant and underappreciated degree, the product of a financial machine that had to keep expanding or collapse entirely. And the most unsettling part is that once that machine was built, it may have made continuous war almost impossible to stop, regardless of who was in charge. So let's go back, not to Napoleon's rise to power in 1799, but much further. Because the true origin of these wars doesn't start with a general. It starts with a bankruptcy. By the late 1780s, the Kingdom of France was, in the most literal financial sense, insolvent. A significant driver of this crisis was France's decision to finance the American Revolution, providing loans, supplies, and military support to the rebelling colonies specifically to weaken its longtime rival, Britain. Historians estimate France spent well over 1 billion livres supporting American independence, an enormous sum that came on top of debts already accumulated from the earlier 7 Years' War. By 1786, roughly half of the French crown's annual revenue was going simply towards servicing existing debt, not toward the actual operation of the state. Finance ministers Jacques Necker and later Charles-Alexandre de Calonne repeatedly proposed reforms, mostly centered on taxing the nobility and clergy, who had historically been largely exempt from direct taxation. These proposals were repeatedly blocked by the very aristocratic institutions that stood to lose their privileges. The resulting political deadlock, layered on top of poor harvests and rising bread prices, was a direct contributor to the Estates General being convened in 1789, the meeting that set the French Revolution in motion. This financial collapse didn't end when the monarchy fell. If anything, it deepened. The new revolutionary government, having inherited a bankrupt treasury and facing invasion from monarchist coalitions determined to crush the revolution, began issuing a paper currency called the assignat, initially backed by confiscated church lands. As war costs mounted through the early 1790s, the government printed dramatically more assignats than the underlying land value could support. By 1796, the currency had become so worthless through hyperinflation that it was formally abandoned, and there are well-documented contemporary accounts of French citizens using near-worthless assignat notes as kindling. This is the financial inheritance that revolutionary France, and eventually Napoleon, would be forced to operate within. A state with essentially no reliable domestic tax base, no functioning currency for years, and an existential war against most of monarchist Europe that showed no sign of stopping. Here is where the story gets deeply strange, and where most conventional retellings of the Napoleonic era miss the mark entirely, because the French revolutionary armies developed a system out of pure necessity that would go on to define French military strategy for the next 2 decades. With the treasury unable to reliably pay, feed, or supply its own soldiers, French revolutionary commanders, and this pattern was well established before Napoleon ever commanded an army, adopted a doctrine of living off the land, formally requisitioning food, horses, money, and supplies from whatever territory the army occupied, whether allied or enemy. This wasn't simply looting in the chaotic sense. It was institutionalized. Occupied cities and territories were assessed formal war contributions, essentially forced payments, alongside outright seizure of goods and valuables. When Napoleon took command of the French Army of Italy in 1796, still years before he seized political power in France, he inherited and dramatically perfected the system. His Italian campaign is frequently taught as a masterclass in military tactics, and it was, but it was equally a masterclass in extraction. Historians estimate Napoleon's Italian campaign generated tens of millions of francs in contributions, indemnities, and confiscated art and treasure. Funds that were used not only to sustain the army in the field, but were sent back to Paris to help stabilize the desperately cash-strapped Directory government. This created a structural incentive that would shape the following 2 decades. A victorious, expanding war with self-financing, and in many periods, directly profitable to the French state, while peace offered no comparable revenue stream, and would have required the state to fund its massive military through ordinary domestic taxation, something the fragile post-revolutionary French state was in no political or administrative position to reliably do. War, in a very concrete financial sense, had become cheaper and more sustainable for France than peace. Now let's turn to the other side of the ledger, because France's wars were never only about France's finances. They were equally shaped by an enormous, sustained financial commitment from Britain, one that historians of this period consider absolutely central to understanding why coalition after coalition kept forming against France, even after repeated catastrophic military defeats. Britain, under Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger for much of this period, adopted an explicit strategy of subsidizing continental allies, paying Austria, Prussia, Russia, and various smaller states substantial sums of British gold specifically to keep their armies in the field against France, since Britain's own military strength was concentrated in its navy rather than a large continental army. These payments became so significant and so widely recognized at the time that Napoleon and his supporters derisively referred to British financing as Pitt's gold, framing continental monarchs as essentially mercenaries fighting on Britain's behalf, rather than out of genuine ideological opposition to the revolution. The scale of this was substantial. British subsidy payments to coalition partners across the wars totaled many tens of millions of pounds, financed in significant part by Britain's own growing national debt, and by the innovative use of a wartime income tax, first introduced by Pitt in 1798 specifically to help fund this sustained continental war effort. Itself a remarkable historical footnote, since income tax as a concept was largely born out of the financial demands of fighting Napoleon. This dynamic meant that even when French armies won decisive victories and individual coalition members sued for peace, Britain retained both the financial means and the strategic motivation to help assemble the next coalition. Because a Europe under French domination, and specifically French control over continental ports that could be used against British trade and shipping, represented an existential threat to British commercial and naval interests that no single battlefield defeat could resolve. By 1806, with much of continental Europe under French control or influence following a string of decisive victories, Napoleon attempted to solve the persistent British problem economically, rather than through direct invasion, an option made largely impractical by Britain's naval dominance, confirmed decisively at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree, establishing what became known as the Continental System, a sweeping economic blockade prohibiting European nations under French control or influence from trading with Britain at all. The strategic logic was straightforward. Britain's economy depended heavily on continental trade, and if France could seal off the entire European market, British commerce, and Napoleon believed ultimately British political will to continue the war, would collapse. In practice, the continental system proved enormously difficult to enforce and created significant economic hardship across much of Europe, including in France itself and among its allies, since continental economies had also grown deeply dependent on British trade, British colonial goods, and access to British markets for their own exports. Smuggling became rampant. Historians studying the period, including work on the blockade's economic effects, have documented that the continental system likely damaged the economies enforcing it nearly as much as it damaged Britain, whose access to overseas colonial and global markets outside continental Europe substantially cushioned the impact. This economic strain was particularly acute in Russia. Tsar Alexander I had formally joined the continental system following the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, but the Russian economy, heavily dependent on exporting timber, grain, and other raw materials to Britain, suffered severely under the trade restrictions. By late 1810, facing mounting domestic economic pressure and a Russian currency that was depreciating sharply, Alexander effectively abandoned the blockade, opening Russian ports to neutral shipping that functioned in practice as a workaround allowing British goods back into the Russian market. This is the part of Napoleon's story that popular history tends to compress into something closer to arrogance and overreach, when the documented economic context tells a considerably more specific story. Napoleon's catastrophic 1812 invasion of Russia, an event that cost the lives of a substantial majority of the roughly 600,000 soldiers in the Grande Armée and marked the definitive turning point in his fall from power, is frequently taught primarily as a story of hubris, a conqueror who believed he was invincible marching into a disastrous Russian winter. Weather and logistics absolutely played a devastating role once the campaign began. But historians studying Napoleon's actual strategic reasoning, drawing on his own correspondence and the accounts of his ministers, point specifically to Russia's abandonment of the Continental system as the immediate and decisive trigger for the invasion. Alexander's decision to reopen trade with Britain represented, in Napoleon's economic strategy, an existential crack in the entire blockade system he had spent years constructing at enormous cost to France and its allies. If Russia could defect from the Continental system without consequence, the entire economic war against Britain, which Napoleon had staked enormous political and military capital on, risked unraveling completely, and other reluctant Continental partners might follow Russia's lead. Napoleon's invasion, in this light, was substantially a punitive economic enforcement action against a defecting economic partner, launched to preserve the credibility and functioning of a blockade strategy, rather than simply an act of unprovoked territorial ambition. There's one more piece of this financial puzzle that deserves far more attention than it typically receives in popular retellings, because it directly connects Napoleon's European war financing to a decision that permanently reshaped North America. In 1803, facing renewed and imminent war with Britain and needing funds urgently to prepare the French military, Napoleon made the decision to sell the vast Louisiana territory, roughly 828,000 square miles of North American land that France had only recently reacquired from Spain, to the United States for approximately $15 million. Napoleon's own finance minister, François Barbé-Marbois, who negotiated the sale, later documented that Napoleon viewed the territory as essentially indefensible against the Royal Navy in the coming conflict, and calculated that the immediate cash was far more valuable to the war effort against Britain than a distant colonial possession he had little realistic ability to hold or defend. The Louisiana Purchase is almost always taught in American classrooms purely as a triumph of American territorial expansion under President Jefferson. It's far less commonly taught, even though it's thoroughly documented, as what it also was from the French perspective. A direct wartime financial transaction, converting a colonial asset France couldn't defend into immediate capital for the renewed war against Britain that followed almost immediately afterward, when the fragile Peace of Amiens collapsed in 1803. Now, let me bring all of these threads together, because the true complexity of the Napoleonic Wars is not captured by any single explanation, whether that's Napoleon's ambition or any other individual factor, but, by the way, an entire financial architecture, built out of desperate necessity, made continuous warfare structurally self-sustaining for France, and structurally necessary for Britain to prevent. You had a French monarchy that bankrupted itself, financing another nation's revolution, creating the fiscal collapse that triggered the French Revolution itself. You had a revolutionary government that, lacking any reliable currency or domestic tax base, developed a war machine that financed itself through conquest, making expansion more fiscally sustainable than peace. You had Napoleon inheriting and perfecting that extraction system, turning military victory into direct government revenue. You had a British government spending enormous sums of gold, funded by a war-driven national debt and history's first sustained income tax, specifically to keep continental coalitions fighting France on Britain's behalf. You had an economic blockade, the Continental system, designed to defeat Britain through trade rather than invasion, one that inflicted such severe economic damage on Russia that its abandonment became the specific documented trigger for Napoleon's catastrophic 1812 invasion. And underlying much of the early war financing, you had the sale of an entire American territory, converted into immediate war capital against Britain. Each of these factors alone might have produced a shorter, more contained conflict. Together, they produced a self-perpetuating financial and economic system in which continuous warfare became, for extended periods, more fiscally logical for the states involved than peace would have been. What conventional history gets wrong, time and again, is reducing 2 decades of European warfare to the psychology and ambition of one extraordinarily talented general. That framing isn't just incomplete. It obscures a deeper and considerably more uncomfortable truth: that Napoleon operated within and substantially depended upon a financial system that made war profitable for France and necessary for Britain to prevent, regardless of who happened to be sitting in the position of emperor or prime minister at any given moment. When we talk about a war machine that financed itself through requisitions and indemnities, those terms don't capture what it actually felt like to live under occupation. They don't capture the Italian, German, and Polish farming families whose grain stores, livestock, and horses were formally requisitioned to feed a foreign army, often leaving communities facing genuine famine conditions in the aftermath. They don't capture the roughly 1 million French soldiers, drawn overwhelmingly from rural peasant families, through an increasingly unpopular conscription system, who died across 2 decades of continuous campaigning, a demographic loss so severe that French population growth and average male height measurably lagged behind other European nations for a generation afterward, a phenomenon economic historians have specifically studied and documented. They don't capture the estimated 400,000 to 600,000 French Grand Duchy of Warsaw and other Allied troops who marched into Russia in 1812, of whom historians estimate fewer than 100,000 returned, many suffering catastrophic frostbite, starvation, and disease during the retreat. A human catastrophe that unfolded substantially because a trade agreement broke down. And they don't capture the countless communities across Spain and Portugal that endured a brutal years-long guerrilla insurgency against French occupation, a conflict so vicious it gave the modern world the very word guerrilla, and one directly connected to French attempts to enforce the Continental system's trade restrictions on the Iberian Peninsula. This is a pattern that should feel uncomfortably familiar to anyone watching how modern conflicts are sustained. Economic blockades and sanctions designed to defeat an adversary without direct military confrontation frequently inflict severe collateral damage on the very economies enforcing them. Wars that begin with clear strategic logic often develop their own internal financial momentum, creating stakeholders, military-industrial interests, and occupied territory revenue streams that make ending the conflict harder than continuing it. And great powers financing proxy allies to sustain distant conflicts, rather than fighting directly themselves, remains, more than 2 centuries after Pitt's gold, one of the most consistent patterns in how prolonged wars are actually kept running. The conventional story of the Napoleonic Wars is comforting in a way. It tells us one extraordinarily gifted and ambitious man simply couldn't stop conquering until the rest of Europe finally united to stop him. It implies the wars were essentially a story of individual character, hubris meeting its inevitable limits. But the real story is far less reassuring. The real story is that the wars were sustained by a financial architecture on both sides, a French war machine that had to expand to survive fiscally, and a British subsidy system explicitly designed to prevent any peace that left France dominant. That made 2 decades of near-continuous warfare not an aberration, but close to the rational, self-reinforcing outcome of the underlying economic incentives every major power involved was operating under. That's the real lesson of Napoleon's wars. Not that ambitious individuals can reshape history. They can, and clearly did. The lesson is that ambition alone rarely sustains a war for 2 decades. What sustains it is a financial system where continuing the conflict serves the immediate economic interests of the people and institutions with the power to end it. So the next time someone tells you Napoleon's wars happened because one man simply wouldn't stop conquering, you'll know better. You'll know that beneath the battlefield, glory and the tactical genius sat a financial machine, built out of bankruptcy and desperation, that made war pay for itself and made peace, for a very long time, the more expensive and more dangerous option for nearly everyone involved. If this story reshaped the way you think about how wars actually sustain themselves, take a moment and hit that subscribe button. We go deep on the forces that actually move markets, nations, and the global order, the kind of stories that don't make the evening news, but quietly shape the world you live in. Drop a comment below with your take. Was it France's self-financing war machine, Britain's subsidies to its coalition allies, or the collapse of the Continental system that mattered most in driving 2 decades of continuous warfare? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video. It genuinely helps the channel reach more people who care about understanding how money and power actually work. I'll see you in the next one.